Sean Kinney. I'm the editor-in-chief at RCR Wireless News, and I want to thank you for joining our discussion today on enhanced mobile broadband and how 5G can broadly enable digital transformation of various high-value enterprises. We've got a great panel for you today. I'll introduce them in just a moment, but by way of housekeeping, I'll note that the session today is being recorded, and we will make that recording as well as slides available to registrants on demand. There's also a companion report that we're working on that's going to take a deeper dive into this topic, so please be on the lookout for that later this month. And I'd encourage the audience to use the webinar portal to submit questions throughout our session. We've reserved some time following the presentations to answer your questions, so please keep those coming in. To give you a brief idea of what we're going to dig into today, I'm going to start with this premise that the focus of 5G today is on providing higher speeds and lower latencies to consumers that have compatible handsets. But for operators, that isn't really where they're going to realize long-term new service revenue and revenue growth. So the revenue from 5G is going to flow to operators from enterprises that are going to take advantage of not just enhanced mobile broadband, but also opportunities around massive Internet of Things implementations, URLLC, those ultra reliable low latency links. And then you have some supporting technologies like compute infrastructure that's distributed out towards the edge of the network, wherever that might be. And then artificial intelligence that can take these high velocity data flows and then turn them into actionable insight that can be applied directly to the specific business outcomes that these vertical industries are trying to achieve. I'm pleased to introduce our panelists for the discussion today, Mr. Will Townsend, Senior Analyst at Moor Insights and Strategy, John Arnold, Principal at J. Arnold and Associates, and Tony Rutkowski, CEO of Netmagic Associates, LLC. I talked a little bit about what we're going to discuss, but to give you more by way of agenda, we're going to talk about 5G for the consumer segment, which is certainly important. And that is, like I said, where the industry is focused today. But then we're going to look at how this long-term accretive value for operators is going to come from selling 5G to enterprises as they execute on their digital transformation strategies. We'll look at some of the verticals and the use cases where the full feature set of 5G, that's the enhanced mobile broadband, the massive IoT, and the ultra reliable low latency communications can really shine. And then what is the role of edge computing and artificial intelligence there? And then when you take that as a whole, this is the technology set that will drive the shift in manufacturing, for example, to smart manufacturing, from logistics to smart logistics, and so on across a number of high-value verticals. So with LTE and predecessor generations of cellular, operators were focused on selling connectivity and SIM cards. This is where you hear this characterization of operators as providing a dumb pipe. That's really changing with 5G, and to capture the revenue opportunities that 5G can present, you got to change that mindset. So what does that mean in practice? It means that operators have to move away from this transactional sales approach. Here's your connectivity that's paired to an SLA that we've negotiated. And they have to really start a consultative approach wherein they look at these verticals and they gain a deep understanding of the needs in that sector. What are your current pain points? I'll pick manufacturing again in this example. And what can 5G do to solve the pain points that we see in manufacturing? And then how do I, the operator, get from just selling connectivity to selling a connectivity-based business solution that will resonate with that manufacturing buyer? Tony, it looks like we're getting a little audio feedback. If you could fix that, please. Now I'd like to just go through a few examples here. I've mentioned manufacturing. That's one of my favorites. I'll stick with that. So if you take a really high level view, the goal of manufacturing interests is to automate process, improve efficiency, and drive top and bottom line growth. So what's the role of 5G? Well, you're going to move from a wired static factory floor to a wireless dynamic factory that can be reconfigured on the fly to really meet what the capabilities are in terms of what can we do within the four walls of the factory that are responsive to the ebbs and flows in demand from both consumers and in the kind of logistics, your input into whatever it is that you're making. Beyond just the connectivity, IoT is a crucial component here. You have to outfit your plant with all sorts of sensors to capture data. From there, you take that data and you can analyze it in near real time. One of the use cases here is for plant machinery. You can move from a reactive approach to maintenance to a proactive approach to maintenance. So all of a sudden you can use this data and the analysis that you're doing to predict machine failures before they occur. You can mitigate those failures and you can avoid unplanned downtime, which obviously has direct cost implications. Beyond the 5G piece, that's just your access technology to make that network real-time and responsive. You need to have some localized compute at the edge of the network, which in this case would be your factory. So given the volume of the data and the speed at which it's being produced and the speed at which it needs to be analyzed to be meaningful, you also have to introduce artificial intelligence and machine learning-based decision-making. So what I've laid out here is sort of aspirational to get from where we are today to that aspirational goal of a more automated, more efficient factory. It's a slow process, but it's a process that gradually gets you towards that goal of maximized efficiency and automation. And you can take these same principles, you can apply them to ports, you can apply them to the supply chain as a whole, really any vertical that you pick. Connectivity and sensors can let you know where your assets are anywhere in the world at any point in time. So that has implications for that port facility, for the ships that bring the containers to the port, for the retail facility that receives the containers after they leave the port, and so on. I think you understand the connection there. And then, if you want to drive down another layer, let's assume that what's in your port containers is something that needs to be held at specific temperature thresholds. So there's a sensor for that. So in addition to knowing where that asset is, you can get sensor data that'll tell you exactly what its condition is at any point in time. And that all hinges on the IoT sensor and the connectivity, then the ability to ingest and understand that data. So there are a lot of moving pieces here, including liberalized access to spectrum, inroads being made by what we traditionally think of as cloud firms, consumption, delivery models, a host of others. But I'll leave it there and turn it over to Will Townsend of Moor Insights and Strategy.
Thanks, Sean. Pleasure to be with you today, and excellent summary of the opportunity with 5G and mobile broadband. When I thought about the topics for discussion today, I kind of broke it into kind of four key areas. One really is I think about the digital divide in rural America, and I've recently spent some time with Tractor Supply Company that has quite a expansive footprint in the U.S. as an example. It got me thinking, and also there's been some news around the possibility of the United States Postal Service serving as mini base stations to connect the digital divide. One of the big challenges in rural America is the lack of fiber, as well as just the economics of having fewer subscribers to amortize that expensive investment in deploying 5G, which is in the billions of dollars when you look at recent spectrum auctions with C-band in the United States, and just the pure cost of hardware as well. And so, from my perspective, fixed wireless access could be a lever that could be pulled very, very effectively to bring underserved areas the needed, mobility and access. And so I think that's potentially a game changer with 5G when you look at not only the throughput, but the latency improvements that come along with it. Secondly, looking at monetization, I think you did a great job of talking about, the fact that, carriers are not going to be able to recoup their investment purely by providing access. And I've been a little bit critical in a 4G world that seemed to be the focus, unlimited plans for consumers, not a lot of depth on enterprise services. And so that's going to have to change with 5G. When you look at the cost of spectrum, when you look at new things like millimeter wave, that's going to require densification in those urban areas. And so, from a public network deployment standpoint, network slicing is going to be critical. It's been talked about quite a bit. I think you touched on it as well. The ability for an operator to guarantee a level of service, whether it's throughput or it's latency, will have huge monetization opportunities tied to it. And then I think from an enterprise perspective, I'm very focused on private cellular networking. And with the democratization of spectrum, when you look at CBRS and what that's accomplished, now enterprises finally have access to licensed spectrum, and they can start deploying cellular infrastructure in areas that are just probably not appropriate, for Wi-Fi. And what's quite interesting as well, when you look at the majority of the OT environments or the non-carpeted environments of enterprises, historically they've been unconnected. And so 5G is really going to bring that connectivity opportunity to manufacturing, as you cited earlier. If we go to the next slide, the third point is talking about use cases. And from a consumer standpoint, there's a lot of low-hanging fruit. Low latency mobile gaming is something that I believe that subscribers will be willing to pay an additional amount of money for. That's more of an access thing, but the operators globally are getting smarter about tying specific services to that as well. So it's not just having ultra low latency for your Pokemon Go experience, but you're going to see new streaming services come online, from my perspective, that are going to provide added value for consumers. And the other big trend too, Intel has been a proponent of this smart stadium or smart venue. What's really exciting when you look at what operators like Verizon and AT&T are doing in sporting venues and music venues, as we come out of COVID, put that in the rearview mirror, and we start attending these group events again. 5G is going to be able to enable a whole new immersive experience with mixed reality and provide just an enhanced overall experience for consumers. So, from my perspective, the low latency, that sub 5 millisecond latency that we will see with standalone 5G networks is going to be a game changer and unlock a host of really exciting use cases for consumers. But getting to the enterprise side, and you touched on this, everyone talks about Industry 4.0. And I referenced the fact that historically, the manufacturing side of things has been either underconnected, underserved, or it's been a hodgepodge of a mishmash of different, wireless, technologies, as well as wire technologies. 5G, with its propagation at the lower band and at the mid band, good propagation with great performance, is really going to unlock a whole number of digital transformation use cases. And certainly factory automation is going to be huge. Machine to machine, person to machine, 5G is going to be able to facilitate that. And there's another exciting use case that I've spoken to in the past, and it's this whole notion of extended SME. And what the idea behind that is, think about a field service scenario. Let's say it's an oil and gas scenario where a technician is sent out into the field to fix a very complicated piece of machinery. What's really going to be game changing with 5G is that almost real-time video connectivity to one of these emerging folding devices. We're seeing devices from Huawei, we're seeing devices from Samsung, a number of companies. And one of the advantages of 5G is that it supports a massively larger number of devices, and it supports low power as well. And so 5G is going to drive, it's sort of chicken and egg right now, but 5G will drive these really innovative form factors. And what's really exciting is that a company can train a technician with a basic amount of information, equip them with one of these new form factors, and then using real-time video and using like mixed reality, can overlay schematics and that sort of thing on top of a piece of machinery or a valve or whatever, and be able to fix that very quickly. The advantage to the enterprise will be not having to spend a lot of money in training a full field service organization they could have some experts in a call center that are connected with these technicians that have a good basic amount of training, and be able to diagnose these issues actually much more quickly as well with AR and VR and that sort of thing. So I think you're going to start seeing more of those applications as we move to standalone deployments of 5G. And then finally, as I thought about today's topics, there are a lot of new technologies that are being integrated into the networking stack, both on the enterprise side of things and as well as the service provider side of things, and edge computing and artificial intelligence. And when I think about those two technology platforms, they can really supercharge 5G use cases. And it's all about putting intelligence and compute and storage capabilities at the point where data is created. And that's going to improve the overall customer experience. And many people speak to edge as being the new cloud. I completely agree. Actually, this week, the Linux Foundation is hosting its virtual Open Networking and Edge Summit, and they published a report that scopes that they believe that edge infrastructure will have a value of over $800 billion by 2028. And it's hard to disagree with that when you look at what edge technology can do to improve latency and performance, not only for consumers, but also for enterprises. So with that, Sean, I'll kick it back to you.
Hey, great stuff, Will. Thank you very much for that. And now I would like to introduce Mr. John Arnold.
Okay, thanks. Thank you, Sean, and welcome everybody. Will and Sean, both of you touched on a lot of things I'm going to amplify, and that's okay. I'm coming at this space, everybody, from the perspective of a technology analyst, where my primary focus is on collaboration and communication technologies. And I'm going to give you a bit of maybe a different take on what I see by the term enterprise digital transformation. But I've got quite a few takeaways here for the operators that we're trying to share this with today. So I'm nodding my head at a lot of what you guys have been saying so far, and something that just came to mind to me just now. I was just recently today reading about it. You talk about use cases, Will and Sean, use case that really illustrates this in terms of what we're struggling with today. The pandemic is the biggest challenge we're facing, regardless of what industry we're in, and I was reading about an initiative that's going on with Honeywell, and they're using, I think it's the Charlotte Motor Speedway as the site for mass vaccination for COVID. And I can't think of a more complicated logistical thing when you think about the scale of vaccination, how fast we're trying to do things. And it really is a fantastic use case that brings the things we're talking about today together, namely AI and IoT. I don't know how much of this is 5G, but it probably is 5G driven, to communicate in real time to get all of these people in the right place, going through the line safely, getting the vaccines administered, all the logistics around this. You can just imagine. It's one thing when you're doing it on a shop floor with machines. It's another thing when you have thousands of people who are not only there to get their vaccines, but they want to do it safely and quickly, and they're very anxious. A lot of variables there you don't have to deal with on the shop floor. So I think it illustrates when you have to do the job, that's a use case where you bring out the best in these technologies, really for human good, because this is a scale issue, which is exactly what AI is good for. So I just thought I'd throw that in as a new piece to add. And now I'll come back to what I want to talk about here. The thing that I see in this space when we're talking about all of these things, I look at this as a nexus of three big ideas: 5G, AI, and IoT. And when you think about integrating all of these things together, what are the use cases and possibilities for operators? It gets really, really interesting, because each on their own offers compelling use cases and applications. But when you want to kind of get the best of all of them, you kind of take it to another level of possibility. And we're kind of living in this time today, thanks to the cloud. So when I think of enterprise digital transformation, in literal terms, I think about enterprise as in the workplace. So I want to talk a little bit about that first, and then I'll touch on some of the other use case examples. So in the workplace itself, I'm going to have 2 slides here. One about what I call smart working. In other words, how these technologies can make us more productive in our jobs. This is mostly about, offices and knowledge workers, but that's a big chunk of the workforce. And the second use case is how do you make the environment itself smart workspaces? Each of these has distinct use cases and offer really interesting opportunities for carriers. So on the smart working side, just a few examples of what I mean by that. These things are actually being deployed in the market today, mostly in Asia, in Korea, South Korea, Singapore, places like this where the wireless infrastructure is very advanced, and they're way ahead of us in a lot of ways in adopting some of these technologies. So these are the kind of things that we're talking about. The ability for workers to walk through workspaces with ease. No ID cards, keys, or codes. So the efficiency that they can get their work done goes up. It may not be orders of magnitude, but these are the little things that help make the workers more productive, leveraging these technologies. That's a big deal. The more dispersed you are, the easier it is to get around, you save time. Facial recognition with AI, faster, more accurate forms of authentication. This plays in a lot of ways. Again, you can start your meetings a little faster, you can get your work done a little faster, access files a little faster, incremental things, but they add up. Then there's the whole VDI model, right? The virtual desktop. Now, again, when you have that strong wireless 5G infrastructure going, now you only need that mobile device to get your work done anywhere. You just go into the workspaces where there's a docking station, put your mobile device in play, and you're instantly connected to everything and anything that you need to get your work done. That brings all kinds of efficiencies to the modern workplace today. Very cool, and I can see how this is going to evolve over the next couple of years. Now, Will, you touched on this a little bit, and I'm going to say more about this a little later too. Holographic calls and meetings for remote team workers. Now, this is mostly AR and VR. This expands collaboration possibilities, especially when you have people working from home and, of course, global dispersed teams. The power of this technology to create these likenesses in real time needs this nexus to happen. It needs AI. This is not so much an IoT thing, but it definitely needs AI and 5G to bring these pieces together. To amplify that a little further, last week I was tracked the Microsoft Ignite event, and they, if you don't know, they launched Mesh, which is their mixed reality platform. And if you like AR and VR, mixed reality takes things to a whole other level. And again, your earlier reference, Will, to some of these like in the field applications, they showed us a great demo of an engineer doing a bridge inspection, totally using holographic imagery, 3D rendering, spatial technologies, really impressive stuff, things that you can't do or even do safely in the real world environment. So there will be loads of applications there. Some of this will play out into the collaboration space. Yes, it will have bigger applications elsewhere, but it is going to be a use case there as well. Okay, Sean, I'll just go to the next slide for the second use case, which is the workspace. All right, so these are tools to make us more productive as employees, as workers in our jobs. Okay, now in the workspace itself, now we're getting into the smart office space, which of course has been along for many years, but these technologies brought together take things again to another level. You have things like digital wayfinding, so people don't get lost. You know, you're in an office building for the first time, you don't know your way around. Think about how much easier it is to find the meeting room you need to get to, or others tracking your progress so they can help you get to where you're gonna go. This is actually a big deal in campus environments when you think about hospitals, universities, when people are gonna go visit family members who are recovering from an operation. You know how vast some of these hospital and healthcare facilities are. Wayfinding systems can be a really, really beneficial thing to have. Booking meeting rooms, the whole idea of automating the process end to end with these tools, the sensors that detect everything that's going on. Once you get in the room, now you have things like, this is a perfect IoT scenario, tracking things like lighting, humidity, temperature, noise levels, all done dynamically and touchless. And that's relevant to today, of course, when we're in this pandemic environment and businesses want people back in the office when they can. But they're only going to go back if they feel safe. So the more touchless you can make the environment, great use case here to create that smart work, not just smart workspace, but safe workspace. So other forms of IoT here, motion and proximity sensing, monitoring the air quality, controlling the room access. So these are things that make the workspace safe physically for unauthorized people, keeping them out of rooms that you are trying to be private about. And then, of course, on the social distancing side of things, this is going to play big, not just within a business's office environment, but for landlords who are the commercial realtors who have to be responsible for everything that goes on in that building. And there might be 100 offices like yours, and they have responsibilities as well to keep their spaces safe. And then there's also the efficiency in terms of layout and space usage here, right? Heat map sensors can help optimize the use of space. And this is important because with so much work from home happening, a lot of businesses, of course, are trying to downsize their office footprint. So they want to have less space, but still be efficient. Well, these tools can really help optimize the use of space when it's busy, when it's not busy, and it can really help in terms of everything that goes on around in that workspace. So again, workspace, workplace is one use case. Then how do you make the workers themselves smarter and more efficient? So those are what I look at here as enterprise digital transformation in the sense of collaboration and the workplace. Now, future considerations, again, for our prime audience, the carriers, service providers. Okay, we're talking, as I said earlier, about these AR, VR, MR, immersive technologies. They are coming, it's early, but whether you're watching what Microsoft is doing, I've seen similar things from Cisco, Google, they're all going down this road using these immersive technologies. They are going to be standard for the way a lot of work gets done in the future. But you can't have it unless you've got that 5G infrastructure as we heard earlier, to keep the latency levels low so the real-time qualities are there. Otherwise, people won't use it. So the goal for enterprises is to have seamless anywhere working, and that's what these technologies do. That should be the focus, not, as we heard earlier, just to deliver cheaper voice and faster connectivity. That's a different focus for the value of what a service provider brings. And when these technologies, this nexus, as I say, of 5G, IoT, and AI together, it's not about communications. It's all about data, right? Mobile devices are going to evolve beyond today's smartphones. So as much as we're married to our iPhones today and our Android devices as communications endpoints, that's okay, but these endpoints are going to evolve into entirely different types of devices that will be optimized for leveraging all of the things I was talking about earlier, this VDI infrastructure, the ability to get everything done that you need on this device, but it's not to make phone calls to people, it's to interact with other forms of data or visual things to get your work done. And with that, we are at 5G today, and it's still rolling out, of course, got a long way to go. But if you're thinking longer term as an operator, 6G is the next wave. There's the Hexa-X project. These things are still early days, of course, but the main idea here, again, it's not about communications. We live today largely in a physical environment. When we start bringing these immersive technologies into play, the world of 6G is about bridging physical and virtual worlds. And Sean gave Will gave some examples earlier of this, but that's kind of where this is going to go. And there's also a broader, more noble mission here, and this came out earlier about broadband infrastructure, making it more widely available. There is this idea of providing greater digital inclusion globally. So there are so many communities, we talked about rural people can't get fiber. Across the world, there are a lot of pockets that aren't part of this digital revolution. And when we get these technologies working to bridge those gaps and connect, because again, the game plan with IoT is connecting more and more devices, but also here, connecting more and more people. When you can get both people and devices connected at scale, that's where the efficiencies of these technologies really start to pay off. Okay, Sean, I got one more slide before handing it over. Okay, so as takeaways, I think we all know this, the main idea here for operators is that the data volumes will keep growing exponentially, as I mentioned before, so volume business with IoT and AI, right? So we need 5G to scale and keep costs down, not just for the carriers themselves, of course, for their own network infrastructure, but for the end customers. So these cycles are just going to keep getting, it's that network effect, right? The more you have, the faster it grows, because there are really no limits to this stuff once the infrastructure is in place. So the model, the business model, will be about data and digital applications. As we heard earlier, voice and telephony may make you good money today, but the agility is needed to become more focused on data and digital applications, not so much about everyday communications. And if that's maybe a big shift in thinking, but that's where the future is, because if traditional service providers don't make that transition, there will be plenty of people who are not traditional players in the communication space who will step in and provide those capabilities. Also, to monetize, to make this a successful transition, IoT has to be understood as an ecosystem play. Where operators will bring value is in having a lot of partners in their ecosystem and the ability to support new services and monetize them. We heard earlier about the fat dumb pipe. That's just not going to be enough. So operators have to think very differently about what this is all about. Ecosystem play is not really native to how business is done today, but that's what IoT requires. And finally, as I mentioned, enterprise collaboration is interesting, but it's actually a weak use case for this nexus I've been talking about. We've already heard about, you know, what I would call industrial IoT. That's where the really interesting applications are. And I just want to leave you with the takeaway that the difference is what I think is what is most important, is that we are dealing with people, person-to-person communications and data streams. That's a much harder environment to automate. And automation is the big payoff for these technologies. But M2M spaces, industrial IoT, obviously the opportunities are greater there. Why? Because you don't have to deal with people. You're only automating machines, processes. So the interesting idea here is the less there are people involved, the greater the opportunity. And today, service providers, certainly with 3, 4, and even early 5G, they're primarily serving people. But when you layer IoT and AI onto connectivity services for mobile providers, you got to think differently about, no, it's not so much people we're trying to really create benefits for, it's for machines. It's for automation, because that's ultimately the end game for this stuff. Okay, with that, Sean, I will pass on to Tony.
Yeah, thanks very much, John. A lot to unpack there, and we'll get to it in the Q&A, and I'll remind our audience to please keep submitting questions. And now it's a pleasure to introduce Mr. Tony Rutkowski.
Hi, everyone. Pleased to be interacting with you. And my perspective here is perhaps a bit different. I began probably 6, 7 years ago now, engaged in some of the international standards activity that was a precursor to what's referred to as 5G. That began in the ETSI NFE group. And then that was all brought into 3GPP, where it's been manifested as 5G. So what I tried to do is, in conjunction with this activity, provide a kind of an overview of the ecosystem in which this activity is being manifested. In my certainly experience, this has always been about enterprises, in the sense that the real revolution here is the virtualization of all the infrastructure and the equipment, and being able to manifest on demand essentially anywhere in the world. Virtualized architectures, services, protocols. My primary activity has actually been in the security area, in many of these venues where I lead some of the 5G security related initiatives. The one diagram gives you a sense that most of this activity is occurring in 3GPP, and you have these clusters dealing with the radio access network, the architecture, and end devices, and that's a massive amount of activity that is occurring constantly. Almost every day, there are a couple of meetings occurring in 3GPP, typically among many hundreds of participating companies and individuals around the world. It's not unusual for one of these meetings to be processing 1,000 or 2,000 documents. So it's extremely intensive activity. The other thing that's occurring is that it's being staged in a way like an operating system, which is typically the way 3GPP is operated. So 5G as a hybrid with the existing backward capability is referred to as release 16. Release 17 is focused on sort of pure virtualized network capabilities. Release 18 starts to get into some of the really interesting new developments, particularly for satellite-based 5G. But 5G and virtualization doesn't really care what the underlying transport infrastructure is. And that's reflected in the fact that there's wireline, wireless, and satellite and cable based infrastructure and groups engaged in this activity, which is sort of reflected in some of these various venues, in which I've sort of translated into the acronyms on the right hand side, so you get some sense of what this what these acronyms mean. So if we could go to the next slide, you sort of get into the rubber meeting the road. All of this stuff is pretty much open, so you can actually go to the work item website, for example, for 3GPP. There's a couple thousand work items listed there. You can basically download them all and begin looking through them, or begin to or basically dive down into particular areas of interest. What I tried to do here is look at all the release 16, 17, and 18 work items that seem to me to be particularly relevant for enterprise work items. And you can see that they go to basically enabling architectures for enterprises in a variety of different ways. There's several that are really quite interesting that go to, for example, mission critical services. So these are services for the specialized communities and agencies, and for example, federal government users that require mission critical capability support. You also have in the various studies and work items and specifications that go to factory uses, and then also one of the more kind of intriguing ones. In fact, there's going to be an upcoming tutorial that ETSI and the International Railway Organization is hosting on how 5G infrastructure is going to be manifested in railway systems. And last but not least, here you can see some of the work items that go to satellite systems, satellite access, to the critical problems of dealing with meeting the regulatory requirements and legal requirements in different countries, because literally what you have here is 5G infrastructure and services being manifested transnationally across borders, and having an understanding and ability of how to do that is pretty important. So with that, and then I should explain. So in that diagram, you not only have basically the code for the work item, as well as the acronym that's used to track it. And you can actually take one of those acronym codes, for example, just stick it in a browser, in a search engine, and you can actually call up all the implementations of it. The release indicates basically where in this staged rollout that falls, and then the lead group is it goes to this specific 3GPP group that were shown on the previous slide. So with that, I think I'll turn it over to the next person in the queue here, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Hey, thanks very much, Tony. And now we're going to move into some Q&A. So I'd invite all of the panelists to turn their cameras and audio on, and then let's dig in here. So, Will, maybe we'll start with you. You mentioned fixed wireless access in your presentation. This has always been interesting to me, just for our audience. You know, this is how Verizon went to market with 5G, with a proprietary standard that they've since evolved to comply with the 5G NR out of 3GPP. That's a millimeter wave play.
Yep.
And then we see T-Mobile also kind of exploring the concept. I believe they're doing an LTE-based pilot with some plans to move to 5G at some point. Seen a little action from Telstra down in Australia, but just give me a reality check. What do you think realistic expectations for fixed wireless access in 2021?
Well, you know, 5G, I always like to say 5G is not a light switch, it's a journey. And operators are in different stages of their deployments. You know, I touched on standalone earlier. That's bringing that radio access network, you know, upgrade with an upgraded core. And that's what really, you know, truly, you know, gets us to the promise of 5G from a latency and a throughput perspective. But I do expect that, you know, operators around the globe will make some solid dents in deploying fixed wireless access. You spoke to Verizon. They actually, their strategy, and they were partnered with Samsung Networks in the US, was to start there. And when you look at their spectrum footprint, you know, they've been kind of focused on millimeter wave, you know, that higher band spectrum. You know, in this last C-band auction, they filled in a lot of their mid-band gaps, you know, spending over $45 billion in spectrum. So you're going to see different operators, you know, getting there, but really, Sean, it depends on, you know, what spectrum assets are they holding, and also where are they at, and just the overall network build out. I mean, a lot of this does require densification with small cells and that sort of thing. But I mean, a long way to answer your question. But you know, I think we will see operators, you know, moving in that right direction. Now, you know, will it solve the digital divide in rural parts of not only the US, but other parts of the world? Likely, that's not going to be as high a priority, again, because, you know, they're going to go deploy initially where they can get the most subscriber, you know, monetization. But the good news is that you have, at least, you know, in the US, and I've read in other parts of the world as well, governments are stepping in to provide subsidies and incentives. And if you remember when T-Mobile acquired Sprint, one of the FCC requirements was for the new T-Mobile to emphasize building out rural America. So fixed wireless access, again, from my perspective, is going to be a key linchpin.
Excellent. And then, John, I really enjoyed your presentation looking at some of the kind of use cases that'll ride on that nexus of 5G, IoT, and AI. And if I was a commercial real estate owner or a building manager, there was a lot to unpack there in your presentation. So I guess for me, I kind of formed my thesis around why CRE should be investing in this stuff prior to COVID. And at the time, it seemed like a no-brainer. You can use 5G, IoT, and AI to attract new tenants by offering them kind of these digitized amenities. But I guess that logic changes a little bit post-COVID when you need to get people back into these buildings and ramp that capacity. So, I mean, maybe you could talk to us a little bit about how investments that we might characterize as under the umbrella of a smart building can also be construed as a safe building.
Sure, Sean. Yeah, I don't want to take us too far off topic for the industrial stuff, but it starts to. I kind of look at this as like concentric circles of, you've got the smart worker, but you've also got the smart workspace, and you've got the smart building. And before you know it, because we're going between home and office, this starts to also kind of bleed into smart cities, because now when you talk about tracking for purposes of super spreader events, right? For these applications which are all driven off of our mobile devices, by the way, as well as our social media activity. Those two applications provide all the digital crumbs needed to know exactly where people are, who they're seeing, etc. That's more of a COVID story, but it bleeds out into smart city. So I think, for commercial real estate operators, I think there's certainly things to think about that they didn't have to before, and not just for the existing inventory, but how they're going to build future buildings, right? How are they going to design these spaces that are going to have to be optimized, not just for IoT, which will be loaded with sensors everywhere. We already have some of that, but for all of these other AI-driven technologies that are going to just touch every part of what we do. So I think we're going to see, in terms of their considerations, there is the amenities that they can do to create good working spaces for the people. But then this came up earlier as well for shop floor asset tracking, right? How can they help maintain, where all the inventories are inside any given office space, especially where there are obviously, expensive, valuable goods that have to be managed. It's going to be, I can see, going back to the operators, being all kinds of kind of like over the top digital tracking services that they could be selling, because no commercial real estate guy wants to be bothered doing this stuff. They'd much rather outsource it to someone who has the expertise and can do it, and there would be plenty of value to that. And I'm sure that they can also build various tiers of these services into the leasing and rental structures. Because you start getting into these things about like air quality, all of a sudden you're talking about all kinds of things that can translate into not just the physical safety and the COVID-related safety, but you can also use this. This is tying into some of these smart healthcare applications that I spoke to on the last webinar I was on with Huawei about things that can provide sensors about using AI and machine learning to track speech patterns. And when they do that with certain types of diagnoses, people with diabetes, people who are having strokes, these can be early indicators of people who are having, health crises that tie into first responders. That's going to be important stuff to have. And I don't know if anyone here could speak to 911 services, but this is a whole other issue when you start getting into if there's a fire in the building or any kind of a disaster hits, how can you respond to these things? So there's so many layers here where these technologies, I think, can create all kinds of new valuable services that realtors can bring as a way to not just lure tenants back into the commercial real estate space, but their employees to come back into the office. Because the key, last thing I want to say, the key to have this term is called return to office, RTO, to bring us back to the workplace. You've got to offer a better experience, because we've been spoiled working at home, all of us here. we're used to this now. So it's got to be damn good for me to go back to a place where I might get COVID sitting around a lot of people I don't know. So they've got a lot to think about. So this technology can be tailor-made for that.
And then Tony, a question for you. I think you gave us a great overview of 3GPP and how some of these other standards organizations are subdivided into working groups to progress forward with the technology. For people that aren't really indoctrinated into how 3GPP operates, it can seem somewhat opaque, but as you pointed out, it's very transparent. You just have to know how to follow the particular work items as they move through the workflow. But I talked in my presentation a lot about how we're seeing this move to put 5G in place for automakers or other manufacturings. You mentioned railways. I'm curious, on the standardization side, are you seeing more participation from these vertical industries wanting to help inform and shape the technology from the standardization phase, or is it still strictly telcos?
Actually, there's relatively few telcos. It's mainly, I mean, you've got hundreds of players that come into those venues, and almost every automobile industry vendor of either gear or the manufacturers themselves are participants. So they have already basically scoped out with the studies, what the use cases are, what the requirements are, and they're now working on the specifications. And this is occurring in almost every vertical industry. So you just got to go in there and find it. I'd also point out, by the way, in reference to one of the previous questions, is 5G satellite is going up like gangbusters. I mean, the Starlink satellites are going up by the bucketful. And you've got AWS and you've got Chinese vendors, you got European vendors, all putting those satellites up. That's all 5G. And so that's going to be serving these rural areas and these developing country areas. And one of the biggest scrambling markets is going to be who's going to be providing those services in the BRICS around the world. So this is all happening extremely quickly. And again, don't get lost in sort of the weeds here. The really important development here is virtualization of everything. And that's the real strength of and tectonic shift that's underway here.
Hey, Sean, if I could add a comment to what Tony was saying. Yeah, I agree. Low orbit satellite, it could be a game changer. You've got SpaceX jumping in. You've got OneWeb that's trying to kind of retrench themselves. But, another technology that I didn't speak to earlier is Open RAN. And, Open RAN, it's disaggregating, the hardware from the software stack. It's driving potential CapEx savings for operators and OpEx savings for operators. Rakuten has been sort of the poster child there, but you're beginning to see this, proliferate. Most operators are doing, proof of concepts with respect to that. But Open RAN can be another lever that can be pulled to very cost effectively, to Tony's point, virtualize these network functions and be able to do it more cost effectively. I was talking about that challenge with chicken and egg, with not having enough subscribers to be able to amortize those billions of dollars in traditional infrastructure investment over. So Open RAN could definitely do that. And Open RAN could also address some of the concerns that the US government has around weaning ourselves off of the dependence off of other countries and driving a domestically sourced 5G supply chain.
Yeah, Open RAN, a very interesting topic in terms of pairing it with liberalized access to spectrum and then taking TCO out of that radio infrastructure, making it much more available to more interests. This maybe speaks to a question that we got in from the audience that I'll direct to you since you mentioned it in your presentation, Will. But
yeah,
when you're an enterprise and you're considering 5G, how do you buy it? What makes it private? Is it getting a slice of a public network that's been bespoke and tailored to your needs, or is it owning your own infrastructure that lives there on-prem, or is it something like CBRS where you have shared access to spectrum and a different type of delivery model?
It's a great question. I think it's all of the above. I think, I know that the public, carriers are going to be slicing their networks to deliver, that guaranteed quality of service. There are going to be other opportunities with respect to, purchasing the infrastructure, and deploying that on your own as an enterprise. Although that's going to be a heavy lift because cellular technology is new to the enterprise, and so they're going to need some advice to do that. But I also see private 5G as a service. There's a startup that I've been working with called Solona, and that's how they're approaching it, and they're attempting to do that to ease the deployment as well as to ease the ongoing management and allow enterprises that that don't have that tribal knowledge around cellular to be able to lean on a solution that sort of does that for them as a service. And the advantage with that is that you can treat that as as an OpEx line item and not CapEx and have to worry about the depreciation. So that's a great question, but I think it's fairly new and people are trying to figure it out. But what I am seeing happen is that it's going to get delivered in multiple ways.
And John, we've got a question that's come across for you. You ended your presentation with kind of advice to service providers. So the question here is, as a service provider in this 5G world, what kind of core skill sets do they need to develop within their organizations? I guess one of my favorite kind of hobbies is to see what type of job postings they advertise on LinkedIn and watch that kind of shift away from engineering towards software development expertise. But what's your take there, John?
Yeah, I think that's it's an important one, right? What do these carriers want to be? And I mean, it speaks at a high level to culture, right? If they're, bellheads, if they're just really totally dyed-in-the-wool traditional carrier mentality, it's going to be hard to make that shift fast enough to how this market is evolving. So the ones who are ready are probably already kind of there and maybe not talking about it too much, but clearly they need different expertise. First they have to understand the opportunities. And if they don't have much in-house expertise in AI, IoT not so much, but AI for sure, how these things are evolving, they've got to have that. I think too, this idea I mentioned earlier that IoT is an ecosystem play, that is a different operating model for carriers than they're used to. And that clearly has to be in their DNA if they're going to have success here. So I think that's part of the way they have to be thinking about these things. And as far as the skills go, if they can't bring it in-house, they either have to hire a lot of young kids who are native to this, or go to where the leaders are, AWS, Google, find out where those engineers are who understand communications, and see if you can get some of that DNA in your world. As we know, carriers tend to be slow. They're not very innovative by nature. And that's going to be a real risk for them if they can't change that mentality around quickly. And no amount of, there could be public-private partnerships that help them with this, but it's not a question of money. It's a question of culture and skill set, that matches where the market's going.
Great. I think we've got time for one more question here. So maybe we'll direct a kind of big picture question to you, Tony. Will mentioned Open RAN. So we've virtualized the radio access network and we've swapped out a tightly integrated proprietary stack for specialized software that's running on commodity servers. So what does the world look like as that approach to virtualizing all of these network functions and having them run as cloud instances across a highly distributed, highly flexible infrastructure? What are the implications of that long-term for not just users, but for network equipment providers and carriers?
Well, I mean, that's the tectonic change. And what it does is I heard some of this dialogue. I'm not sure what a carrier is anymore or what a service provider is anymore. I live in Ashburn, Virginia, which is like the world's largest center for cloud data centers. Uh, there's several layers of providers in there that are going to be rolling out services. So what this does is it, I think, opens up a world of opportunities for everyone. But I think the caveats here is not to have some of this craziness of banning vendors based on country of origin that's been going on over the last couple of years. And that's certainly what I've written a lot about. And allow the innovation to occur with rules of the road that everyone can live with across national borders, because you're going to be having all kinds of people coming together in groups that basically go after the market opportunities and the innovations. And I think we're embarked upon exciting times.
Well, we ran over a little bit. I want to thank our audience for hanging in here. This was a really great discussion. So again, a big thank you to our panelists for participating and for sharing your perspective. And a big thank you to the audience for your time and your attention.